I couldn't be more thrilled that today's guest moderators for the webinar are my esteemed colleagues, leaders from our partners at Carsey and Poole College. Michael Ettlinger is the founding director of UNH's Carsey School of Public Policy. He is a respected thought leader on economic and fiscal policy and previously served in leadership roles in influential Washington, D.C. think tanks. Luciana Echazu is the Associate Director for Undergraduate Education at the Poole College of Business and a member of the college's faculty. An economist by training, her work has been published in top-tier journals, and she is a passionate advocate for embedding sustainability in business education. We host the Changemakers Speaker Series because we know the vital importance of shining a light on the people, the pioneers and the thought leaders who are advancing sustainability in meaningful ways. And we have some great examples of those leaders joining us today. I couldn't possibly do full justice to our speakers' incredibly impressive resumes, so please see their full bios on our website. But I'll just do a brief introduction for each. First, Kate Gordon is Senior Advisor to the US Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm. She has spent the past 2 decades working at the intersection of climate change, energy policy, and economic development, including senior leadership positions at several nonpartisan think tanks. Trained as a community organizer and later in law and regional economic development, her focus has long been on bringing diverse groups together to work to a more sustainable and inclusive economy. Corley Kenner is a public affairs and communications professional with 20 years of experience and currently leads the communications and policy team at Patagonia, one of the most respected companies in the world for their climate advocacy and action. Corley's impressive career has included roles in both the private and public sectors, and we couldn't be more proud that Corley is a UNH graduate, class of 2000. Welcome back to UNH, Corley. And last but no means least, Kathy Koch is the Global Sustainability Tax Leader at EY. Kathy's career has also spanned both the private sector, working for companies such as GE and Amgen, and the public sector, including most recently Chief Policy Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader for Tax and Economics. She also led business outreach for the leader and the Democratic Caucus. So huge thanks to today's speakers for generously sharing your time and insights. And I will now hand over to my colleagues, Michael and Luciana.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation that we are having today and this amazing panel. So welcome, everybody. I'm hoping that you enjoy this conversation too. So the reality of the climate change crisis and the efforts needed to improve our situation are of such magnitude and latitude that it's impossible to actually tackle them from only one side of the economy. Partnerships and intersectoral collaboration are crucial if we want to move the needle towards carbon neutrality, with the private sector focusing on reducing their footprint through their production of goods and services, and the public sector aiding in providing the necessary infrastructure and incentives through policy so that we can achieve this. For example, we need great incentives towards research and development so that we can innovate in clean technologies. And at the same time, we need to find a way to influence and increase the supply and demand for cleaner goods and services in the private sector. And that's why we're here today. And that's also why we have 2 co-moderators and not only 1 moderator. So I'm here representing the College of Business and Economics, and Michael representing the School of Public Policy. So Michael, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, and I wanted to just start by highlighting the latest big report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and it's the global report card on where we are on climate change and what can be done. And it's very recent, and it's very clear that time is running out for getting aggressive. And if we're going to avoid the worst consequences, we need to all get the shoulders to the wheel very quickly, and that's shoulders from across the private and the public sector. So that actually leads to the first question I want to ask our panelists, which is, are there particular aspects of that report and the reports that have come out that stand out to you? And how is that affecting how you're approaching your work? And why don't we start with Kate? Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Michael. I hope you can hear me. Having some audio issues earlier. It's a great question. And first, let me say thank you so much for inviting me and us. And I love the interdisciplinary and intersectoral approach. Definitely, we in the Biden administration feel that this is a whole of government moment for climate. You'll see just deep engagement from our National Economic Council, our Council of Economic Advisors, as well as, of course, our new Domestic Policy, Climate Policy Office. So pretty exciting, besides which, of course, my agency, Department of Energy, is all in. And Michael, I would say to your question, the IPCC reports are always a little scary and inspiring. I mean, the point of the reports is always to say, we're running out of time, but then they usually also say, and this one did as well, but we can do things to deal with this situation. There are solutions, there are ways to move forward. And, I am somebody who, and I think a lot of us working on climate kind of are all about operationalizing the solutions, because otherwise you just get deeply depressed. So I think it's really important to kind of turn to solutions. And so, to me, this report was really important in a couple of ways, unlike earlier IPCC reports. One is that it did what they all do, which is to talk a lot about the mitigation side, about, building out more clean energy, making sure that we're decarbonizing, making sure the electrons we produce are as clean as possible. But this one went further and really put a pin on something that I think we all need to be thinking about, which is the need for carbon removal. So not just decarbonizing, but actually removing carbon from the atmosphere, which is a critically important thing to do, not only for today's environment, but also into the future. There are several sectors of the economy that are just incredibly hard to decarbonize. And there's sectors that we rely on and we will keep relying on. Steel and cement are two obvious ones. The chemical industry is quite hard to decarbonize. These are things that our industrial economy runs on. And, until we have some major innovations, it's going to be pretty tough to decarbonize those. Aviation fuel, another big one. So given that there will still be, even in the most aggressive scenarios, a fair amount of liquid fuel out there and carbon, we need to do carbon removal. So that was one big thing. And the other big thing that I think was really important about this report is we've had kind of a false dichotomy, I think, between mitigating carbon emissions or reducing them and adapting to climate change. And this report, I think, really brought together the points that we are having to adapt now and become more resilient today while thinking about decarbonizing. And I think that's critically important. And frankly, something we're thinking about a lot as we're building out all this infrastructure, it has to be resilient. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kate. And Kathy, same question.
Thank you. I think that the headline that struck us most is that we're not getting to 1.5. And that really activated a lot of our clients, a lot of our internal people, that it's not, emissions aren't going down soon enough. They're not going down fast enough. And then there's all the kind of ramifications of 1.5. And you look at biodiversity and the extinction rate and what's happening with the inequity with which the impact of global warming is distributed is that's an issue. That's an issue for our business and for our employees, for our customers. So the whole idea of, we got to get faster. We have to, and we have to start at home. We have to really mean business. So I think it was the 1.5 is just not going to happen unless something drastic occurs, was one of really kind of got the attention of a lot of our leaders as well as a lot of our clients.
Thank you. Corley? Where are you in my picture? Did we lose Corley?
I'm here.
Oh, I didn't see you on my screen, but I'm glad you're here. Go ahead.
I'm glad to be here too, Michael. Thank you. And let me just also acknowledge, yeah, super proud to be a Wildcat and I'm really excited to be here today. So like Kathy and Kate, I think what jumped out to us is this sort of to keep rising global temperatures under 1.5 degrees Celsius this century, we have to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and we have the technology to do it. It's achievable. It's definitely hard, but it is doable today. The other thing that really occurred to us is just how crazy the current political moment is here at home and elsewhere around the world. In my family, we have this saying that climate change is only political if you think the facts are debatable. And I think we should really kind of hold ourselves to that. This report and all the ones before it really just reinforce what we try to do every day at Patagonia, which is use our business and our brand to save the planet.
And picking up on that, Corley, and the conversation about, not just mitigation, but removal. And now we actually have to do that while we're adapting to the change because it's already here. Patagonia has had specific goals on climate action for many years now. And so this is a hard question because how can you summarize all the strategies that Patagonia has implemented in the context of a for-profit business in a world where not all businesses are practicing the same thing, and so at some points it might be frustrating or perhaps inspiring. And how does your status as a B corporation affect that strategy that you have?
Great question. Thank you. I think I'll take that in reverse, if that's okay. So Patagonia became a registered benefit corporation in 2012. It was the first day we were legally able to do that in California, which is where our headquarters are. And for those of you not familiar, a benefit corporation, quite simply but powerfully, really means that we must consider the impact of all of our business decisions on all of our stakeholders, not just those with financial interests in the company. So we think about how every part of our business affects people and planet. And by the way, I recently learned about UNH's Bee Impact Clinic and really excited to see y'all lift this movement up and be a part of it. So at Patagonia, we think this is important because in these times, because of this crisis, every business should have a clearly defined purpose, and it should be held accountable to its employees and the workers, in our case, the workers that help build our products, our customers and our community, and the natural environment. And so yes, we have a climate strategy. It's complicated. I'll try to be succinct here, but we really think about it in two parts. And one is within our own business and how we make our products and the supply chain that supports that. And what can we do to reduce our carbon footprint there and also share how we're doing that. And then on the other side, we think about our community and all of the environmental nonprofits that we support who work every day locally and globally to address this challenge. And we work to lift up their voices and really lean into community-driven solutions that will reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and increase our reliance on nature-based climate solutions.
Thank you, Corley. And sometimes when we think of the private sector and we're thinking about the goods that are traded, right? So it's a little bit more tangible to look at it from that point of view. But Kathy, you work in the service side of the private sector. And so we just heard from Corley how one particularly motivated company is making a difference. And EY actually works with so many companies across many industries and the world. And you worked both in and outside of the government. So what do you see more generally as the business role in addressing climate change?
I think the business role is actually more important than ever, especially in the US in particular, with the difficulty getting legislation passed. I think it's up to business leaders to stand up and say, you know, this policy is okay, investment is okay, carbon pricing is okay, whatever is kind of the, for me, it would be carbon pricing. I think businesses should stand up and say, it's, you know, it's okay, and give cover or start the conversation on a national level in a way that doesn't, you know, that helps it, that pushes it. And I think businesses have to step up now because governments are having trouble getting stuff done. The other thing that businesses can do is make, you know, a lot of businesses are making these commitments, right? We ourselves are net zero. We're going to be carbon negative in 2020. We're carbon negative now, we're going to be carbon net zero in 2025. We're making these announcements. And then I think it's up to us to say, you know, how we did it, to really kind of come through on our commitments and be very proud of them, push them, because the more companies that do it, the more questionable it becomes for companies that don't do it, I think. And those commitments, especially when it comes to Scope 3 emissions, which aren't really taken into account in these pledges, they're really important too, to kind of put pressure on.
Yeah, I can see that. And so, oh, you froze for a moment there.
Oh, I froze. I wasn't sure.
But that's okay. But you were finishing that thought. So would you mind repeating?
Okay, where did I like the supply chain pressure on everyone that we work with, I think, or pressure or questions or discussions with our supply chain. I think that's really important. And for us, you know, our big footprint is flight, but for a lot of our customers, supply chain is a bigger issue. But, you know, all companies should start not only to kind of answer for themselves, that that's key, but let's look at the entire chain, because that, I think, is where you hit a lot of the emissions.
And putting in that peer pressure on one another and that competitive spirit of that private businesses have. Yeah, absolutely.
True, yeah.
So as a follow-up to that, for both of you in the private sector, so Corley and Kathy, what do you see are the most important things that companies can do to reduce that carbon footprint?
Corley, you go first.
Okay, sure thing. So yeah, we really have distilled this down to 5 things at Patagonia. And the first is, which is a big part of this, map your carbon footprint, as Kathy pointed out, through that Scope 3 level. That's really important. And really make those substantive investments in how you can remove and reduce your company's supply chain emissions in alignment with science-based targets. In our case, for instance, we're looking at where some of our products are produced in coal-fired production facilities. How can we work with other partners in those same facilities to convert them to wind and solar? And then in our materials, how can we work to ensure that we have no virgin petroleum in our products? We're trying to do that over the next 5 years. The second thing is evaluate your financial partners and commit to using those who are contributing most to a global energy transition. It's wild. Large commercial banks continue to support investments in fossil fuels, and they will only stop if big businesses tell them they must stop. The third is support the grassroots groups who are working on the front lines to support communities most affected by the climate crisis. The fourth, protect nature, especially through indigenous and community-led efforts that would restore land and water. And fifth, in the corporate doublespeak, where your company's political contributions and business affiliations, they are often sabotaging the work being done at that policy level. And while it's great that so many companies are making these promises, they really must be held accountable to it.
So those are great ones. I should borrow some of them and go back to my office and say, hey, but measuring first and foremost, because you don't really know unless you measure, and it's quite surprising. A lot of the impacts, when we look at our flight impact, because we travel all around the world for our clients, but at some point you have to say, wow, that's, these are expensive in terms of carbon. So my, kind of other idea that I like to talk about is internal carbon pricing, because then not only do, people like Corley and me, and Kay, people who are kind of doing this in the business, but everyone finds out what their footprint is of their activities if there's internal carbon pricing. And there's a couple companies that are kind of way ahead on this. And but the idea that you make every person aware of choices, I think is actually very impactful. Our employees care about this. They demand this from the company. Everyone wants to work in my group because we do carbon and environmental issues and sustainability, but knowing really what your impact is every time you buy a plane ticket, every time you drive in, every time you order this, that, or the next supply, I think that can be very impactful, especially if it's not just a shadow price, but it's collected from the business unit and then maybe pooled and donated or something. But it has to be a financial incentive there, and I think that that's actually that can be quite powerful in terms of awareness and behavior.
Kate, this is a good segue to what I wanted to ask Kate. Kathy has raised incentives, and government obviously has a big role. A large part of what government does is creating incentives and disincentives. And I know you've been following the impact of what the SEC is doing, the climate risk executive order, and of course, everything the Department of Energy is doing. So, what role do you see those kinds of actions by government, how those actions affect how businesses conduct themselves with respect to carbon and climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. First I would just, I think even adding on to Corley and Kathy, another really critical piece of the puzzle that is a driver from the private sector side, is these commitments. These net zero commitments aren't just ambitious commitments and kind of an opportunity to be on a stage at the Conference of the Parties for the UN. They really have actually driven markets. And the best, most recent example of that is, Stripe's commitment to carbon removal and huge amount of investor activity in that space, because there is suddenly yes, it's a voluntary market, but there's suddenly a market for carbon removal that doesn't exist otherwise because it's not included in most cap and trade programs, and we don't have a global price on carbon. So that's actually a great example of just actual business decisions and those commitments kind of spurring real activity that I think is really important. And also totally agree with Kathy on the side on transparency around commitments. And that goes to your question, Michael. Probably one of the most important things happening at the government level right now, and it's a little under the radar for many people, though those in the business community are paying a lot of attention, is the Securities and Exchange Commission work around getting toward disclosure of climate risk. So for many years, actually, the SEC has defined physical climate risk particularly, but also the risk of falling behind in the transition. So there's two big kinds of climate risk that people talk about in the financial sector. One is physical risk, sort of the wildfires, the floods, the sea level rise. The other is transition risk, which is sort of the risk of having stranded assets. Let's say you invest today in a coal plant, probably not a great idea. So the SEC has thought of these as material risks for a long time, but not really defined what that means or what companies should do about it. And now we're moving toward a system, to your question, Michael, where the SEC is actually trying to work through what mandatory disclosure would look like of those risks. That is a very big deal in terms of the underlying system that finances all these things. Corley, to your point, banks are still investing in fossil. You start requiring disclosure, you start looking at the actual risks, and you start looking at that in granularity as a financial issue. It changes the game on what investors will invest in. And so that's a huge, huge deal. Something that I don't work on directly at DOE, but I did a lot of work on before this position in helping to figure out how to kind of translate those risks, particularly the physical risks, into economics. And I'll just say from my state government experience in California, these are really significant risks to government as well. So, we spent in California $1 billion on wildfire response in 2020. That wasn't even any of the mitigation or the resilience strategies. It was literally just firefighters and vehicles. That was 3 times what we budgeted for. So that money has to come from somewhere. Governments, state governments, and local governments are increasingly shifting money over to pay for these responses. So that's a big part of it, Michael. And the other big part of it is, of course, investment in the solution side, which is kind of where DOE is 100% of the time. I'll say this quickly, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed, it makes me crazy when people say that we haven't passed a climate bill. That bill is an enormous investment in the energy transition. DOE alone, for context, our normal appropriated budget is $45 billion, give or take. DOE alone got $62 billion in that budget in appropriations. It's 60 new programs over the next 5 years. We have completely restructured the department around it. We now created an undersecretary of infrastructure. We're doing deployment and demonstration all across the board, and massively increasing our energy efficiency investments as well. So it's a really big deal and a big moment. And I think just circling back to the very beginning of the panel, it's a demonstration of energy as an economic strategy for the country, economic resilience, economic security, especially in this moment. And through these coal companies that I work with a lot, most of my work is in energy communities that are transitioning. It's economic diversification into a more stable set of industries. So super exciting, lots going on. But I think that these underlying, government cannot do it all, 100%, but the underlying structures around how we measure and manage this stuff are really important. And then what government does do really well is that initial funding, is that basic science and research and that initial demonstration and deployment funding.
Thank you so much. And I agree, as an economist, of course, I cannot disagree with you on everything that you are saying, but it is a huge undertaking. It's a big investment on the side of the government so that you can provide the necessary support for the private sector to find that, strategically speaking, this is a profitable solution, right? Looking at being more responsible in the way that we're doing things is a winning solution. So this panel is not just intending to highlight the role of the public and the private sector, but also the importance of collaboration across sectors. And I'm reading this book by Bill Gates on how to avert this climate crisis. And at some point he said, it took me to get sued to realize that I should have been working with the government and trying to find solutions for our business practices, right? So do you feel that there has been progress in that cross-sectoral collaboration? And are there good examples that you've been involved in?
Yeah, I think there's enormous progress in that, and actually, Bill Gates has been a big part of that progress. What he did do back during the Obama administration was help to catalyze this mission innovation concept, where he really pulled together a number of private sector actors, mostly wealthy individuals, family offices, and said, we will put up X amount of money if the government will do its part and sort of put up, Y amount of money, and together we can, innovate and we can do the pieces that we each do well. And that was dormant for a few years in the last administration, but has really been stepped up again with new commitments from those investors, as well as from the Department of Energy coming back on board. So I think that's a good example. Those innovations are in things that are not covered very well by the sort of the venture community, I would say. A lot of what we're looking at in this clean energy transition is big, capital intensive stuff. So we are really looking at building out, big systems, whether those are utility scale solar and wind systems, whether they're, green hydrogen systems, whether they're, significantly more transmission. I'm at a conference today, actually in New York, where we're talking about nuclear, new nuclear investments. And one of the interesting data points that I learned, and I suspected this, but I hadn't heard it proven, but we're looking at a tripling of electricity demand in this country by 2050. And that's because of course, electrifying our cars, electrifying our buildings. And frankly, some of the climate impacts on parts of the country will make people use a lot more air conditioning. So huge increase in demand. We have to meet that demand. So that's a lot of transmission. This stuff is hard. It's not easy for venture to get their heads around. They don't really like to do big manufacturing plants. It's too early stage for most of the traditional banks. And so what we've seen with the Gates mission innovation approach is that they've come, and now frankly with Stripe doing what it's doing, which I think is also leading to this, is kind of just more focus on those, that what they call that valley of death between kind of basic research and these sort of like proven and now commercializable products. But I can't put too strong a point on this, and I know it's hard. This is a tough thing, and you see a lot of news around it right now, but the reality is that the clean energy economy will require us, as somebody said on a panel I was on the other day, to dig up a lot of stuff and to build a lot of stuff. And it is still an industrial economy. It is still an industrial economy. So how do we think about that in a way that's equitable and sustainable and more resilient? And frankly, build it differently than we did the first industrial economy is the big challenge to all of us. We've got to do that in partnership with the private sector.
Corley, any stories you want to share in terms of your experiences with cross-sectoral collaboration?
Sure. I'll take an example from the other side of the spectrum from what Kate was just describing, and that's in the nature-based climate realm. And we're seeing a lot of momentum in the regenerative organic agriculture movement. And this is really exciting for us because we very much are inspired by this notion of farming the way nature intended us to, and see a lot of potential here for how we can draw down carbon and give back to the planet. And so in terms of like how we're seeing this build across sectors, we're seeing increasing interest from farmers themselves who definitely feel the effects of this crisis and want to contribute to slowing it. We're seeing it from other brands like ours who want to build their products more responsibly and invest in this kind of agriculture so that we can build products that are giving back to the planet. And we're seeing an interest from the government in how they can incentivize farmers and brands to support this kind of agriculture. So pretty exciting. It's newer, but it's definitely gaining momentum, and we think holds a lot of promise.
And Kathy, how about in your neck of the woods?
So in my neck of the woods, we actually have, speaking of nature-based solutions, we have increasing number of companies coming to us and saying, I can plant forests, I can, in the nature-based area, I can generate X carbon credits and real carbon credits, and asking for verification and asking for monitoring that kind of, gives faith in the voluntary credit market, which, when you talk about collaboration between business and government, we did see a lot of movement in the authorized credit, the government credit market in the Glasgow COP. But now I have clients who are coming to us and asking, how can we generate solid credits? How can we buy solid credits? How can we kind of conform to the policies that were espoused at the COP? And what I'm told, I've never gone to another COP, but I was at this COP in Glasgow. There was far more business presence and business interest and business involvement. The voice of business, again, they are being forced by all kinds of, stakeholders to behave in a certain way, to make certain commitments, to reduce their footprint. And policies by governments help rationalize those investments, right? If I just, by shrinking the green premia, which is my favorite Bill Gates statement that I know, that, these policies make these behaviors rational, from a financial perspective. And I would say that in my particular little neck of the woods is we have a lot of businesses that want to go up and meet with policymakers on issues, in this area. So collaboration with members of Congress on policy design, that's really important. I mean, it may, robust policy is a matter of collaboration from a lot of parties. And I've seen far more, or many of my business clients are very interested in going up to the Hill and talking about policy development that may end up in kind of the climate title of Build Back Better. And they want to make it workable for them. They want to make it robust. And I think they should be congratulated for going up there. I mean, they're not going up there to give away money. I get that. But start being in the conversation is critical for robust policy.
Thanks. Kathy. So something that a couple of you have alluded to a couple of times is the fact that central to these discussions, whether on the government or the business side, is the issue of equity. Certainly, the harms of climate change are not distributed equitably, and it's hard to imagine solutions that are practical and certainly sustainable if they aren't just inequitable. So I guess, I'm sort of stating an opinion there and making an assumption. So I guess my first question is, do people agree with that? And the second is, how is that reflected in the approach each of you take? And maybe I'll throw that to Corley first.
Okay, well, we absolutely agree with that. And we actually have a film coming out about this tomorrow, but there's an entire community, an indigenous community in Alaska, Newtok, Alaska, that's having to relocate because of climate. Imagine that, like your whole town having to move. And so, yeah, there is no question that this crisis is hitting all of us, but it's hitting certain communities in a much more dramatic and drastic way. And so yes, I've spoken about this before, but I think it definitely bears repeating. Listening to those most affected by this crisis and putting those community-led and community-driven solutions is the only way we can have any hope of addressing this crisis in a more just and equitable way. It must be done through that lens.
Kate?
Yeah, this is I think people know a core tenet of this administration. The first executive order, or I think close to the first that the president signed, was actually focused on addressing racial equity. And close to the second was one about addressing the climate crisis that actually called out two particular communities as really directly affected by this economic transition that we're in. One is actually those communities that were kind of leaders in the current fossil energy economy. Many of those communities exist because of the resource that they're developing. And as those resources decline, for a variety of reasons, or we shift to other technologies, those communities are really affected. Their tax revenues are affected, their jobs are affected. The other set of communities is those that we're addressing through the Justice 40 initiative, which really are disadvantaged communities, disadvantaged for a host of other reasons, income, historic racism, redlining, all kinds of reasons. I would add a third priority community of this administration, which is rural and remote communities. In the energy system in particular, those rural and islanded communities are often facing an enormous energy burden. And looking again at Alaska, because I was just there, there are communities in Alaska that rely on diesel for electricity because they're not on a power grid that's resilient or sustainable in any way. And they're paying up to $17 a gallon right now for diesel in parts of Alaska. And that is just insane from an energy burden perspective. So we, I think, are looking first at the fact that there are priority communities and that this affects every community differently. To Corley's listening point, if there's one thing I've learned in 20 years of working with communities on clean energy and transition, it's there is no one size fits all solution. There is no one industry that replaces the other industry. There is no one path or approach. So we are trying as an administration and at Department of Energy specifically to actually really start building in those systems. We call this place-based initiatives, right? So thinking about places and people when we do our work, how is the work affecting those places? What assets do they bring to the table? I'm a little bit obsessed right now with the fact that coal plants are these amazing assets actually for the clean energy industry. They have transmission, they have transportation, they have a workforce that's willing and trained, and they also have water rights, which are really rare in a lot of parts of the country. How can we think about those as assets, not problems to be solved? And then just really working with communities on that. This is super challenging though, Michael, for DOE. I just want to be really honest. Like, we were started in 1977 to come up with basic science and research kind of ideas around energy security. And we don't really have, we're not EPA, we're not USDA, we don't really have a robust community engagement arm at DOE. So this is in some ways a part of our current challenge in really operationalizing what we're saying here is building those systems into what we're doing. And a big part of how we're doing this, the last thing I'll say, we created, for the bipartisan infrastructure law, we created an internal equity, labor, and economic prosperity committee. That's all high-level people in the department, and I co-chair it with Shalonda Baker, who runs our economic impact and diversity office. And we are actually working to integrate those values into our funding opportunity announcements and into our actual paperwork on this infrastructure bill, so that we are funding projects that not only meet technical specifications, but also meet our equity and labor and justice specifications. So it's super hard work.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you how this sort of related to the infrastructure bill, but I think you've kind of answered that.
Yeah, I mean, it hugely does, right? It's the single biggest opportunity we have to get money out the door. So this is a way for this stuff to survive us, right, politically as well.
And that's sort of part of what you're prioritizing with the infrastructure money. Yeah. One thing I wanted to touch on that's related to the equity issue is the issue of greenwashing. So there are companies that sort of put on a public face of being green and promoting equity without actually doing the work. And Kathy, I'm sure EY has clients that have a range of postures with respect to their green practices. So my question is, given that and given where you're coming from, like, how do you work with the full range of them and advise them related to climate and carbon and all of this?
Well, the companies that come to my particular practice on sustainability, they're going to want to do, they want to follow the letter of the law because it just is stupid not to. And while they may be a kind of a range of behaviors in response to climate demands, I think most are pretty well intentioned. I mean, they may not be, they do what they need to do and they're transparent. And we wouldn't have a client, unless they were doing what they said they would do, they would generally not be our client. And I've found, when we look at the carbon credit markets and we see there was a lot of greenwashing, or there, allegedly a lot of greenwashing. I only say allegedly because I wasn't personally involved in any of, the discovery. Right now, we have a lot of clients coming to us and they want good credits. They make a point of asking for credits with a good reputation that won't get them accused of greenwashing. So right now we have clients that are sensitive to these issues. Nobody wants to be called out for kind of being a fake, and better not to even start. But I would say that, yeah, most of my clients are anxious to satisfy market demand for these behaviors. It makes economic sense for businesses to satisfy shareholders, investors, employees, customers, because everyone's asking to see to see the voluntary disclosures. Everyone's asking what they're doing. It's really an interesting issue area where a lot of this demand is kind of coming from the bottom up and the sides in, rather than, or in addition to government kind of top down. There's a lot of demand all through the economy for this.
So Coralie, as someone at a company that works very, very hard to walk the walk, like how do we address companies that don't? They're not Kathy's clients, to be clear.
That's right. But the others.
The other ones.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for us, our approach is we always want to start by calling companies in, and also being super clear that, like, we're interested in sharing the solutions we're finding. We don't want this to be our competitive advantage. We want to share with others so they don't have an excuse. And one example, a somewhat recent example, is a few years ago, we figured out how to make a wetsuit out of natural rubber instead of one based from petroleum derivatives. And it didn't compromise performance, and it's a great ULEX wetsuit. And so when we found that solution, we started telling the world, we have the best weed in town and we're giving it away for free. And the notion here is that, again, wasn't meant to be a competitive advantage. This is something we wanted other companies to take, use, sell, and they too can then reduce their footprint. But when companies don't, and this is something we've been spending a lot of time on lately, we do think we need to put some pressure on that. And we think about this notion of corporate accountability. And we've really been trying to give that some more substance lately. And the solution that we're finding is that the government is actually the right partner in this endeavor. And the government can have regulations and can use legislation to hold these companies accountable. And that's what we want to see happen. And that's why we are increasingly trying to lift up our voice and those that agree with us on this issue, because there's not a singular business voice on Capitol Hill. And we think the Hill and the administration is interested in hearing from companies who want to see these kinds of regulations and this kind of legislation passed.
Interesting. Let me, I don't want to, so let me just ask this of Kate, sort of quickly. You know, the infrastructure bill passed, big climate aspect to that for sure, and it's a big climate bill. But it didn't get everything done. Are there other things that you view as particular priorities in terms of what still needs to be done from the government side?
For sure. And you know, as everyone knows, I think we are still hopeful about parts of what was called the Build Back Better legislation. I think its name has changed again, and I hesitate to even say what I think it's called because I don't know what it's called right now, but the reconciliation package. In particular, there's a couple things in that I think are really still in active discussion, and we just have to focus on. You know, the infrastructure bill is amazing. It's really helpful on that basic infrastructure, obviously on transportation, on broadband, on transmission, the stuff that makes the rest of the stuff work. Also some really important demonstration project work. But the fact is that these industries have to survive to thrive, right? And doing that requires the kind of, you know, tax structures like the investment tax credit and the production tax credit that have made renewable energy able to scale to the last, you know, 10 years, 20 years. There are other technologies that would be added into those tax systems that are really important. It would also provide some more support for, again, for carbon removal. And by that, I don't mean, you know, on coal plants. I mean, really actually like direct air capture, long-term sequestration of carbon, really getting it out of the atmosphere, net negative carbon removal. The other thing that's really important is there's some financing structures in there that that would provide, for instance, you know, support for some of the really tricky pieces around the transition that people don't think about that much, but communities do. One of those is the outstanding debt on coal plants and on retiring plants. If you retire a coal plant early, which many people are doing because utilities have seen that to be, you know, the way the market is going, usually the plant isn't paid off yet. And so there's debt that's been amortized over a period of time, and there's still maybe 10 or 15 years left on it. And the ratepayers will still have to pay that off if you don't figure out a way to finance it and restructure the debt. One of the things that reconciliation bill had opened up was the possibility for the government to support that. Those things are really important. They're operational. They'll make this stuff actually work and have a long life, which I think is critically important to the private sector. I mean, there are no bigger supporters of this bill than people I've talked to in the private sector. So we're still hopeful.
That's really interesting. And as you were mentioning these things, and I'm thinking all the plans and policies that government and the private sector actually do and start, you know, building things together. And we always say life is that thing that happens when you're making plans. And so once we have our plans in place, and you know, you can be super in favor of them or somewhat against them, nonetheless, the plans are there and we're trying to implement them, and someone comes over and kicks the boards and all the pieces go flying, and you're like, what do we do now? And that's one of the things that happened with the invasion of Ukraine this year, that it has upended the energy market, and there have been strong responses by both government and the private sectors. So a question for Kate and Kathy, and let's start with Kate, since you just rounded off the last one. How do you see that playing on long term, especially regarding how government and business will work together, as you know, the geopolitics and markets kind of like crash against each other?
That is a tough question, and I won't do justice to it. I'll just say it's. I think what it's done has really underscored for us both the dependence we still currently have geopolitically on petroleum in particular, and fossils, and the need to speed the transition and become more frankly, energy independent and energy resilient. For us, that's translated into, I mean, we've got to manage the current situation. We're in a current energy economy that we're managing. But you've seen, you know, a lot of commitments to faster transition, particularly in Europe, which is really vulnerable in this situation. Here, I think what it's translated into for us is more of a laser focus on our domestic supply chain. And actually, COVID did that too. So COVID really started that, and then Ukraine kind of put a pin on it, which is, you know, there will continue to be these huge shocks to the system, whether they're, you know, pandemics, whether they're geopolitical and war, or whether they're climate impacts. And those shocks to the system make it even more necessary for us to have, you know, just a more resilient system here, and with our allies. So I think that's where we are. This is a tricky moment, but it's an important one. So I'll stop there.
And yeah, that is a very, very tough question. And I'm glad, Kate, you mentioned COVID, because I was going to kind of point to COVID and say, when COVID happened, everyone thought the EU Green Deal would slow down. Everyone thought, you know, all of the green initiatives would slow down. And in fact, they didn't. They sped up. In fact, the EU used some, you know, the plastics taxes and the carbon border adjustment mechanism to help offset the cost of COVID. So I think that these big kind of perturbations in the system can break either way. But I do think when we look at a lot of these economies, they were determined to, you know, kind of push ahead, because energy transition does a lot for all parts of the economy. And I think the Ukraine, I mean, you know, certainly, yeah, the first thing you think of is energy security. But would an energy security bill kind of pull along maybe just a kind of a climate title? Maybe these things can work together to, you know, to complement each other. I don't think that's going to stop the momentum. And if it does, it will be a very, you know, it would be a tragedy, really. We should look at it as more reason to do it, as Kate kind of implied, rather than reason to pause.
So I'm gonna, we're getting to where we want to move to Q&A from the audience quickly. I'm gonna just ask one more last question, which is that like there's lots of big decisions to be made in all of this. There's, you know, are we going with a price on carbon, Green Deal spending programs, how big should government be, you know, involved in this? And there are tensions, right? There's tensions between government and business, and, you know, there are tensions within the business community as well. And so, you know, I mean, Kate, you know, said that businesses are supporting, you know, the further legislation, but they're probably not in love with some of the corporate tax increases, you know, so there's, you know, there's tensions. And I'd be interested in hearing what you both think are the greatest tensions, and what do you also think like are the best opportunities for better alignment between, you know, business and the government sector? And why don't we start with Corley?
Yeah, well, you stole my thunder a little bit, Michael, but the tension point that is most visible to us is that we're seeing companies talking a lot on climate, but not matching that with the kind of action that's necessary. And in particular, a reluctance to, for instance, change their political giving to support candidates and lawmakers who do support climate legislation. And we're even more disappointed that they continue to use lobbyists and business affiliations that work against climate legislation. And the last one, which you touched on, is that they're not even willing to consider any kind of tax increase to help pay for this. And we're not talking about a tax increase that we've never seen. We're just talking about going back to a corporate tax rate that we saw in the Obama administration that could help cover the costs of some of these programs. And most companies won't even talk about that. And that's pretty disappointing, especially when you consider that the cost of this crisis is only going to get bigger if we don't deal with it today. So that's the tension point that that keeps us up.
So Kathy, what do you see as the biggest tensions and opportunities?
I think the tensions, I mean, right now, if we're talking about, the reconciliation bill, taxes, the tension, I think one of the big tension areas is in carbon pricing. I think that, but it's a tension across the entire community. Personally, and that's just me, Kathy, I believe that if you don't put a price on it to impact behavior as part of a wide portfolio of policies, we're not going to get where we need to get soon enough. But a lot of people have a lot of different approaches on carbon pricing, and for some it's pay to pollute, and for corporations, actually, I see more support for carbon pricing amongst businesses now than ever before. I mean, you see the API come out, the chamber, et cetera. So there's been kind of a surprising reversal of roles not reversal, but when I hear businesses come out for it and then others against it, it's kind of a little, just shows that it's hard to get agreement on this issue. The one thing though that I think corporations realize, for better or for worse, is that the costs of inaction are great, and they're great for all of us. They're especially great for communities that are kind of trapped. The distribution picture on this is horrible. But think about the unpredictability of costs. Businesses hate unpredictable costs, and there's tons of them when it comes to climate, the damages of global warming or climate change. And so I think that's why businesses are they're going to nudge forward, but we have to pull them in. And one of the ways that businesses can work together, and I remember when I was doing ARA, when we were doing the rescue bill, I think the most popular thing we did was 48C, which is an investment credit for advanced manufacturing. And that thing was like $3 billion. It was a limited time offer. I don't know how many weeks it took to sell out, but everybody wants it. Even when I went back to work for Senator Reid, people were still asking for renewal. So opportunities to provide businesses with kind of investment money so they can get into industries where, push the cost curves down and then get in. I think that's a real point of cooperation and then move forward. I'm not saying everyone's going to join hands and kumbaya, but I do think there are points of agreement and there are points of tension that are increasingly workable, but very complicated.
So Kate, people are champing on the bit to ask their own questions. So if you could be brief and what you think are the greatest tensions and
no. I can, although I won't. I mean, there's a lot of potential tension points, although there's a huge amount of opportunity. There's a huge amount of risk and inaction. However, again, we're talking about building out an entirely new industrial economy, which will in fact mean we're not building out current things. So that's a bunch of people. And then it also means building a bunch of things in places where people are not necessarily comfortable building a bunch of things because the last industrial economy left a lot of places behind and people behind, and that's hard. And it means if we're going to do this really equitably, the most important thing we can do for disadvantaged communities is a pathway out of being disadvantaged communities, which means job quality and labor standards and making sure that we have broadly shared economic prosperity. That creates some tension, particularly with some parts of the private sector. So really making sure that our economic agenda is equitable and incorporates that economic prosperity is, not how we have been doing business for the last 30 or 40 years. And it requires a big transition in the business community as well as a big transition in our energy technology.
Thank you. Fiona, you want to take it away with questions?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Michael and Lou, Kate, Corley, and Kathy. What a great discussion. We've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so I want to get to some of those. The first one is from a colleague in the business school, from Lee Mizusawa. For anyone, I think. It is clear that a massive, consistent commitment to deal with climate change is required. Since government needs to be in the mix, can commitment be sustained regardless of executive and legislative branch changes by election?
That is a tough one. This is our problem right now. We see seesaw tax policy, seesaw this other policy. I wish I could believe that it was sustainable. And I think as the damages of climate change become more recognized, and perhaps we should talk about the cost of inaction in more concrete terms, maybe there will come a day when everyone kind of sees, they may not do the same things about it, but they all at least recognize that it needs to be done. But I don't know, if in the next 2 years we're going to see stability, if there's electoral change.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Corley or Kate, anything to add to that? Clearly a huge issue that we're all thinking about.
I mean, I think this is why I'm so focused and we're so focused as an administration on this question, because it's why the fact that the infrastructure bill is a 5-year bill and not a 2-year bill is really important. Those projects will last for decades, many of them. That's really important. How they're designed and built is going to be critical, but if we integrate that early into the design phase, it's going to last. So, I think a lot of work is being done right now for this exact question to try to bring consistency into that program in particular, and into the other work we're doing. But the other side of it is what we talked about earlier, which is underlying changes in the financial system, in business, in how people are thinking about things like ESG, and how people are thinking about translating their commitments into actual purchases of offsets and other things on the voluntary market. That stuff is outside the political system, and really, really important.
And I'll just offer quickly, one, I think let's just remember the power that we all hold as voters to vote in leaders who will address this crisis. Let's not cede office to those that deny the science and are working against it. And again, not about politics, but thinking about your vote and the power of that to help manage this. And yeah, to double down on what Kate said, I think this is why we have to address this crisis through the root causes and not just the symptoms and put Band-Aids on those, right? Really going after those root causes will make it harder for these policies to be undone.
Yeah, well said, Corley. Couldn't agree more. There's a question from Dr. Tom Kelly, who's our Chief Sustainability Officer here at UNH, for all Kate and all of you. I think it's related to the last question. There's stories are going around today about, quote unquote, the perils of invisible government and the concept of, quote unquote, the submerged state, and as to why voters don't seem to be getting the value of the infrastructure bill. How can we better communicate all that is going on and its value as we head towards the midterms? Kate, do you want to take a start on that one?
Great. I mean, I could try. I mean, we're really lucky. We have some great communicators in this administration. My boss, Jennifer Granholm, is like an unparalleled communicator. So I think getting her out there, other members of the cabinet out there, the president, vice president, have been really good about trying to get this message across. I think part of why it isn't getting across yet is that it takes a while for us to design the bill. Like building infrastructure is actually a big deal. And we've been given only 180 days to figure out how to do it by Congress, but that's not a very long time when you're thinking about spending this $1.3 trillion on infrastructure. So I think once the projects start to be built, it'll be easier. The other thing, we really need the environmental community to stop saying that this isn't a climate bill and to start thinking of it as a climate bill, because they are really important communicators on climate. And one of the things that has been very challenging is still the tendency of both the NGOs and also a lot of the climate reporters to frame the infrastructure bill as if it's a piece of the Build Back Better package that's not about climate. And I think that we just really need to be honest about what this is. It is a massive, massive investment in a totally changed system that will underpin our ability to either step up or not step up to meet this crisis. So I would love to see a little more support from our friends out there.
There's a question here from an anonymous attendee. It's a great question though. What do you make of the phrase, "there is no ethical consumption under capitalism"? Do you think, well, let me just phrase it that way. What do you make of the phrase, "there is no ethical consumption under capitalism"? Corley, maybe you could take that one first.
Yeah, wow, it's a powerful question. And I'll just acknowledge we struggle with the notion of not as much capitalism, but growth, right? Because we know when our business grows, our carbon footprint grows. I mean, therefore, the system of capitalism that enables our business is part of the issue here. But I think there are definitely ways that we can make capitalism work for people and planet. Mentioned earlier, the benefit corporation movement. I mean, this is a way that companies can think about not just their bottom line, but people and planet. And I think we can be, our CEO likes to talk about, we can be unapologetic about being a for-profit company if we know that we are using everything available to us to address this planetary crisis and to support thriving communities. But it's tough. I mean, talk about a tension point, but this is one.
Yeah, for sure. Kathy, how do you think about that question in relation to the clients that you work with at EY?
Well, I guess since I've left the government and I work with more businesses on this issue, I think there has to be an approach that says, okay, we are a capitalist system effectively, so let's use the incentives inherent in capitalism to try to develop the industries that we need developed, the technologies that we need developed. Let's try to make it work for us. We're not going to get rid of it, right? So we have to accept, okay, this is the baseline that we're dealing with. And for example, in capitalism, people respond to price and profit. You put a price on carbon, we know demand curves slope down, the price goes up and people buy less of it. Is that okay for a carbon price? Will that diminish emissions, GHG emissions? And I kind of think it is. And I do think there's plenty of schemes that you can design. I shouldn't use the word scheme. There's plenty of policy designs that can take a lot of the revenues and plow it back into the kind of lower, X% of the income distribution, you name it. We could even, there's a big business organization, the Climate Leadership Council, that wants to plow all the money back to people. There are ways to use capitalist kind of targets or triggers to drive behavior. And that's, I think, what we need to do. And I'll just point out that the wind and solar, when I first got into this, business on Congress, they used to be so much more expensive than fossil energy, fossil electricity. But because we had, we gave incentives, we enticed businesses to get into these, get into the technology. Right now, wind and solar are price equivalent with traditional energy. That's a win that I'm not sure it's actually a win of capitalism, but it's certainly, we did use the prices to drive them, to drive that technology. So for what it's worth, I'd say we just need to work with the behaviors work with the system to try to incent the behaviors we would like to drive the result that we want.
Yeah, it's
I
really
could just
interesting.
chime in with
Yeah,
one point,
please, Michael,
which is
go.
that, the IPCC report actually makes a big point about the fact that carbon intensity is going down, but just to oversimplify, but sort of growth is going up faster than carbon intensity is going down. And so, it's kind of a race, and it means it's one of the reasons why we got to really double down on decreasing carbon intensity, because I think people need to realize, if you say we're going to basically like reduce growth, reduce consumption and reduce growth, well, that's sort of talking about locking in a status quo of inequality. That's what you're doing. You're condemning a lot of people to making sort of no progress, and that's very problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot in my classes about the concept of decoupling, right? How do we decouple the notion of growth, right? How can we continue to, expand opportunities, as you're talking about, Michael, while also reducing significantly carbon emissions, right? And it's about a change in business as usual. We can't keep doing business the way we've done it, to sort of have that decoupling between growth and carbon emissions. Ethan McDonough, a current student here at UNH, has put a lot of great questions in the chat. So I want to get to one of Ethan's questions. How will government institute appropriate policies that actually force companies to change their practices if these same companies can still legally influence our politicians? I find the notion that we're having fossil fuel companies, for example, at the table when their policies are being made about fossil fuel and emissions more concerning than promising. I think the thousands of protesters that attended the Glasgow COP26 might agree. Would love to, maybe Kate, maybe you could start with that one.
I can try. It's a good question. I can't get into the world of campaign finance reform here, because it's not my expertise at all. But I will. It's a tricky question. I mean, it's interesting that at the end of that question, raising the specific example of oil companies being in the room, I might challenge that just a little bit. It's companies can, not all of them will. I don't trust all of them too, but companies can diversify and change with changing markets. And one of the things about many in the supply chain of the existing oil and gas industry, which is large, is that it's where most of the geologists work in the world, for instance. And we're going to need geologists for a bunch of things, for geothermal, for long duration carbon sequestration, for just thinking about some of the impacts of these policies, on our geological systems. That's where the geologists are, and they want to work on this stuff. Many of these companies have research and development budgets that they are in fact starting to move in a direction of innovation. Not all of them, again, this is not a general statement, but specific companies have joined the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative and are actually putting money on the table to move this conversation. I don't think we should shut the door on that just because of the company's past. I think we should think about, just as I don't think we should shut the door on fossil fuel energy workers just because they happen to have worked in a coal plant for the past 30 years. Shouldn't we be thinking about opportunities to leverage skills and infrastructure and assets? I think we should. So I wouldn't necessarily shut the door on it, but I do think that the broader question about political influence is an important one, and Coralie made this point earlier, just about using that influence in the direction of where the market is going. Let's align market direction with political spending. That would be helpful, for sure. So that's all I feel like I can say on that one.
I think if I may build up a little bit on what Kate just mentioned, that's important that we talked about who are we leaving behind when we're making these changes. And in the spirit of collaboration, it is important that we open those doors. It is important that we say there's room for you to adapt and we can help you change, and your scientists and geologists can actually help us all find a better solution. and the workers that you have can actually find or continue to find employment, perhaps through other ways once you start adapting what it is that the line of business that you're doing are. And those are important things, is that we all have to come to the table and have that conversation. And for that organizational change to happen, there has to be buy-in from not just the on the government side, but also on the private sector side. And I think that that opening to that dialogue is one of those ways in which we can get that buy-in from them.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lou. Corley, going back to you for a minute, you know, one of the things that you've talked about, and we've read about in things that have been written about Patagonia for a long time, is that you've been sort of the ethos about sharing what you're learning on your sustainability journey with other companies, rather than sort of hoarding it as a competitive advantage, but rather sharing it more broadly. There's a question that was put in the questions, which was, what was one of the biggest things that Patagonia has shared that has helped other corporations the most? And so that as an example, but just in general, you can say a little bit more about, you know, how you think companies should be being more collaborative versus competitive.
Sure. I don't know that there's just one thing, but I'll start with our products. I already mentioned this Ulex wetsuit that we make. We were also one of the first companies to develop the technology to turn plastic bottles into fleece jackets. And now we're seeing that pretty widely adopted, which is really exciting. We learned how to make insulation out of 100% recycled materials. That too, when we first started, we could barely source it. Now we can't source it because everybody wants it, which is great. This is exactly what we want. I think another really important sort of bucket for how we think of what we're doing that's meaningful is this notion that we want to pay an earth tax. And so 1% of sales from everything you buy from us goes to environmental nonprofits. And that notion is important, in that we started this 1% for the planet community. And I think Kathy mentioned this earlier. We were nervous in COVID. Would companies start pulling back from this? And no, in fact, membership in 1% for the planet doubled during over the last 2 years, which is amazing. And it not only doubled here, globally. And so that's really exciting. But I do think the biggest and most important thing is what we were talking about earlier. And Fiona, I think you highlighted this nicely, which is that you can be unapologetic about being a business and work to solve problems and contribute to them. And so if we're a part of changing that dynamic, then great. And I would consider that a really important contribution.
Yeah, thanks so much, Corley. There's a question here, which is sort of like a sort of an elephant in the room question that I think we should definitely get in before we wrap up here. What would you say to companies who, and this is from an attendee, the companies who might go out of business due to some of these new policies? Due to COVID, it seems that some companies are already struggling to make ends meet. If they're required to comply with new climate regulations, etc., how do you see it as feasible for them to keep up with inflation and pay their employees a livable wage? Kathy, maybe do you want to?
Let me start. I mean, because when I think of, climate policies, especially in this administration and the last, there's a lot of carrots out there and not quite as many sticks, right? We don't have, explicit carbon pricing, for example. We don't have carbon pricing. But so to me, I'd say to that company that it, I don't know, could mandatory disclosure, that can be expensive, but there's other things that can be expensive. You buy carbon offsets, maybe that carbon offsets are not free, but there are ways to work them in. However, I see a lot more opportunity in these bills, in these legislations, than I see burdens. Regulatory burdens, and then Kay, you can help me out with this, but a lot of the regulatory measures we see they're not effective day one, right? They go through courts, there's all kinds of stuff. So I'm not sure I think there's more opportunity out there than there is burden. And I would say to them, if they're, come to your policymakers, speak up. If the community doesn't get involved and say, I can't do this because it's too expensive. When I worked on the Hill, we never would have known, absent people coming in and telling us how it affected their day to day. And that's what I would say also is if there are more burdens than carrots for you in this particular legislation, talk to policymakers, because generally speaking, policymakers are interested in employment in their states. And if you come in and you talk about having, to close because of policies, they generally would like to know about it and try to help. Yeah. I mean, that sounds a little Pollyanna, but it is what they want to do.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I just had one thought on this, which was just that for one thing, I think it's a little overblown that like all these businesses are going to go out of business, and the other thing is that I think a lot of businesses sort of perceive risks, to sort of, some of these policies. But the reality is across the market, if the rules and the new policies are equal, like it changes the competitive posture for all the competing businesses in the industry. So it's not like, so like, and, Kate mentioned like, I guess cement, right? Very carbon intensive. It's like, but everyone knows we need cement. Like we can't just like, oh, to heck with it. It's too carbon intensive, we're getting rid of it. We need to accommodate the fact that we need it. And Kate outlined some ways that we might have to address that. So I first thing I would say is that I think it's overblown. The other thing I would say is, coal is there's gonna have to be changes in those communities, and Kate's working on that, which is great. And clearly there's going to be opposition and disruption, which will, I'm not going to say that's going to be painless, but probably child labor laws force some companies out of business too. And it's just like, it's the creative destruction of capitalism. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
I just really quickly on that, agree. And, coal companies saw a huge decline for two reasons that aren't actually about climate policy at all. The first was automation, which dramatically declined the number of workers in the coal industry, and particularly going to mountaintop mining, which is much more automated. And the second, frankly, is hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which was a massive energy innovation. Whatever you think of it, it was a massive energy innovation, and it changed the pricing of natural gas completely. Those are the kind of disruptions that happen in industry, and it's just a reality. Just one thing to Michael's last point too, lifting the floor is a huge priority of this whole administration, and I agree with Michael. I mean, right now it's artificially cheap to do a lot of things because people can pay people almost nothing and expend a huge amount of carbon. And if those things are priced more accurately and equitably, that won't be true for anyone. So it changes the competitive environment.
Absolutely. And with that, I'm just going to send a quick closing question for every one of the speakers today. So this is a sort of a 20-second answer. Kate, we'll have you go first. What is the one piece of advice you'd like to give the students in the room today, or some piece of hope or optimism for the future? Closing thought.
Piece of advice for students. Every industry is going to become about climate and about managing this transition. You don't have to be an environmental sciences major. You don't have to be an environmental economics major. Everything is going in this direction. So the opportunities for you and your career are just endless and exciting. So
perfect.
That's my message.
Thank you, Kate. Kathy.
Well, I would say, since going into government kind of changed my life, I would say be part of the solution. To be in the government, spend some years there. The one problem is many people never leave, and I loved it. But being part of this system actually makes you a lot more realistic about what can be done, how difficult it is. But it also, we need smart people like Kate doing things, helping drive a solution. You can't sit from the outside and complain that people don't get stuff done. I'd say come in and help us. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun too.
Thank you, Kathy. Corley.
Yeah, ditto on what Kate and Kathy both said, and especially also this point going into government right after graduating University of New Hampshire absolutely changed my life and the trajectory of my career. But my advice would be sort of in keeping with the title of this, don't forget that you're a change maker and you have not only a role to play, but the power to do so. And that will help ensure that we have a planet that future generations can enjoy.
Love it, Corley. Yes. Lou.
I would say understand that you won't have to do it alone. We have to do it together. So and understand that you don't necessarily have to agree with everything that happens. So we were talking about, oil companies, etc. Is that it is important that we hear what everybody thinks and what everybody has to say, because that will help us understand where the contracting points are. I think that yes, we have to adapt to what's already happening, but between all of us, as long as you understand of that opportunity for intersectoral collaboration and how you don't have to do this alone, each one of us can make that power of small, right? That small change that will make a great difference when we put them all together.
Yeah, here, here. Michael, I'm going to give you the closing words here. Oh, you're on mute, Michael.
I think I figured that out by now. Yeah, I think people have pretty much covered everything I'd say. I would just say the only thing I would sort of emphasize is that it's easy to read the IPCC report or you look at the paper and what's happening, or more importantly, not happening in Washington or at the United Nations or anywhere, and say, oh my God, this is like, forget it. But, the reality is, like, it's a choice. Like, we all have the world has a choice. The United States has a choice. Our government has a choice. We all have choices we can make that can have a huge impact on this collectively. And we just all need to make the right choices, and to influence others to make the right choices. So I just say, keep the energy up and keep making right choices and trying to get other people to make the right choices, and we'll be okay.
So wonderful words to end on. Michael and Lou, thanks for a great job moderating this conversation today. Kate and Corley and Kathy, it's just been such a pleasure to have your expertise and your perspectives in the room. And thank you so much for prioritizing this in what I know is a really busy time. But thanks, everyone. We will see you again back in September.